Fame for its art, romance, and food.
They have a very particular relationship to their food. It caused the French Revolution.
Why did the baguette cause a nation to revolt? How did the guillotine help invent restaurants?
You kind of sit there with your jaw on the ground just looking at the thing.
How did a pharmacist give the world French fries?
The French certainly knew how to fry.
How did the city, with a little help from Hitler, give the world dance clubs?
That world of the DJ begins in Paris.
Why was half the city deliberately knocked down?
Sometimes a great vision comes by letting the past go.
Yeah, it's almost like they knew that Paris would be the #1 destination in the world.
This is Paris, and you'll never look at it the same way again. In the countryside over northern France, hot air lifts a balloon 3,000 feet above the outskirts of one of the most beautiful cities in the world.
It's amazing to fly in the Paris area, to get these beautiful views. Paris is an amazing city which offers everything that a modern city will offer, but you get all the history. It's a beautiful city.
Paris is a city of innovation. It was here in 1783 that the first recorded balloon flight took place. The Montgolfier brothers' balloon flew 3,000 feet above Paris for a distance of 1.5 miles.
To be one of these guys, the Montgolfier brothers, flying higher than anyone had ever gone before, to look below you and know you could drop like a stone. How scary is that?
The story goes that the first balloonists, they took along a few bottles of champagne because they thought wherever they would land, the farmers would think they were aliens and might stab them to death with pitchforks. Obviously, people have no idea what's going on with this thing, in the sky. And so we still have this tradition nowadays. We still have a few bottles with us for after the landing.
Imagine what these guys were looking at. I mean, for the first time above the Seine, the Royal Palace, Notre Dame Cathedral, these iconic structures, but seen from the above for the first time.
Every time I go to Paris, it just gets more and more magical.
I always imagined that Paris would be a beautiful city, and when I got there, it delivered on every single aspect.
Home to 2.25 million people. Construction in the city center fiercely controlled for over a century. The lifeblood of the city. A river called the Seine.
My favorite views of the city is when I'm walking along the river, because wherever you look, it's extraordinary beauty.
For 2,000 years, the river has fueled the growth of a metropolis. In 300 BC, a Celtic tribe called the Parisii built a walled settlement on an island in the middle of the river, with bridges linking the left and right banks of the Seine.
Paris is quite an important spot for strategical reasons, because it is one of the few places on the Seine River where it was easy to build a bridge.
The Ile de la Cité remains the heart of Paris. Where the Parisii built a temple to their gods, now stands the 12th century cathedral of Notre Dame. All across Paris, the combination of history, architecture, and culture has the effect of reducing romantic inhibitions.
There's a romance to being able to enjoy the environment. It is so overwhelming that all of your little daily worries kind of melt away.
With all this love in the air, it's not surprising that one of the greatest culinary couplings happened here: steak and fries.
Could you imagine a time where a steak and a potato were not paired together, and yet for 1,000 years, they were never even in the same room with each other.
In the 1600s, when the first potatoes arrived in Europe from South America, people weren't impressed. In fact, potatoes were viewed as evil.
The potato was looked down upon by everyone. The potato was a bad food. It was a work of the devil. It supposedly carried disease.
In 1748, the French Parliament bans the cultivation of the potato because they believe it causes leprosy. They're used instead as pig swill.
Crazy. Crazy.
But in Paris, one man would stop at nothing to get humans eating potatoes. His name? Antoine Parmentier. An amateur pharmacist, Parmentier studied the potato and saw it was safe, nutritious, and easy to grow. Now all he had to do was convince everyone else he wasn't mad.
He is trying to figure out, how do we sell the Parisian public on this notion of the potato? So he has this idea to use a little reverse psychology. He digs up a portion of the Tuileries garden, right? The gardens that had been the pleasure ground of the royal family for years and years. Digs it up, plants his potatoes. Then he stations a couple of guards outside his potato patch, and he tells them, you know, if some peasants come by and they want to bribe you to get the potatoes, just let them.
Potatoes become a Parisian staple. But the real game changer was when a French genius chopped them up, dropped them into hot oil, and created the first French fry. History never recorded his name, but when Thomas Jefferson was the U.S. ambassador to France in the late 1700s, he scribbled down the recipe and brought it back to the States.
And he has his cook make them in Monticello, and it becomes this American thing, right? Because Thomas Jefferson is doing it. Let's have some French fries, too.
Every traveler to France, you know, the first night they show up and they go to the hotel and drop their bags and go out to eat, they're probably having a steak frite in a bistro somewhere.
But steak frites isn't the food that defines Paris. That is the baguette.
You see people on their bicycles with their little basket with their baguette, or maybe it's in their backpack, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's true. My cartoons were right. The baguette is everywhere.
And the Parisians' love of the baguette is so strong that when they couldn't buy it, they took to the streets in their thousands.
They have a very particular relationship to their food, so much that it caused the French Revolution.
Paris, early morning. The smell of freshly baked baguettes fills the streets.
I've had the privilege of standing there at 4 in the morning watching the bakers doing their first loaves. It's a holy place. It's a shrine. It's Mecca for bread lovers.
Baguette literally translates as wand, and the French certainly believe in their magic, consuming around 10 billion loaves a year for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
We can bake 4,000, 5,000 for the normal day, and 10,000 for a big day. Baguette, she needs to be crispy outside and soft inside. She needs to have a nice color.
Why does a Parisian baguette taste so good? Is the secret the water? Is the way they handle the flour? Is it the rye?
Master baker Eric Kaiser took 10 years to perfect his craft, even longer than it takes to become a doctor or lawyer. It's labor-intensive, but Parisians would have it no other way.
To sit in a cafe in the morning, have a cafe au lait, and get a big basket with baguette in it and crack that open, boy, oh boy, do I love that first baguette in the morning.
I eat them every day when I'm there, and they just are delicious and crunchy in the morning with confiture spread all over it with cafe au lait. You know you're in Paris. The smell. Ooh, I'm there now.
The baguette is so important to French life that for 300 years, bread production has had its own laws. The ingredients, weight, and size are strictly controlled.
You see, every baguette is between 55-60 centimeters.
Even their holidays are dictated by law. Owners are forced to stagger their vacations, so there's always a bakery open. These laws date back to the late 1700s, when a shortage of bread sent the Parisians into meltdown.
They have a very particular relationship to their food, so much that it caused the French Revolution.
In the 1700s, the French aristocracy and royalty lived in opulent luxury, with personal chefs creating lavish dinners. But the rest of the population barely had enough to eat. In 1788, after a poor grain harvest, the price of bread skyrocketed. The population faced starvation.
You know, there's the famous story. It's probably not true, but symbolically it is true enough. When Marie Antoinette's advisors found out that people are starving, that there isn't enough bread for the people of Paris, she flippantly says, well, if there isn't enough bread, well, let them eat cake.
The people have a better idea: storm the palaces and overthrow the monarchy. Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI meet the guillotine.
When you let one of those blades drop, it's an incredibly brutal thing. But the guillotine was actually invented to be a humane way to kill people.
The device was the brainchild of Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin. In the spirit of the revolution, he believed a pain-free beheading was the right of all condemned citizens, not a privilege reserved for the rich and powerful.
Before, you had different penalties based on your class. So if you were a noble and you committed a heinous crime, your head would be chopped off with an axe or a sword. If you were a peasant and you committed the same crime, you would be hanged. Hanging is a much worse way to go than decapitation. So guillotine says, all right, from now on, everybody gets decapitated, and we're going to do it with this new invention.
Guillotin failed to take into account the efficiency of the well-intended invention. In under a decade, over 40,000 heads rolled. But while France's new leaders chopped their way through the old guard, another group of revolutionaries sharpened their own blades.
Paris has always been a center of revolt. I mean, people have been rising up in that city for centuries.
But this time, the revolution won't be on the streets, but in the kitchens. Paris, France, home to the world's finest dining, from patisseries to fancy restaurants.
Restaurant culture, in the Western sense, came from France. The word restaurant comes from the French verb restaurer, to restore, to make whole again. And when I first came around in the food world as a young culinarian, Paris was the be-all and end-all.
The Parisians invented food as an experience. People built vacations around certain restaurants. You know, you don't do that just anywhere. You do that in Paris.
A Chicago native, Daniel Rose first came to Paris in search of girls and a good time, but found his calling in the kitchen. Today he wows diners at his restaurant called Spring.
Chefs in France are part of a kind of a pantheon of cultural heroes in a way that they're not necessarily in other cultures.
This high regard for chefs stems from the late 1700s, when the French Revolution brought about the first restaurants.
Restaurants didn't exist before they happened in Paris, which is hard for us to imagine today.
Before the revolution, France's finest chefs worked exclusively for the aristocrats. But when their employers started losing their heads, chefs found themselves losing their jobs. To earn a living, they started cooking for the people of Paris.
You have to remember that in previous eras, people ate at home or they took food home, but there was no place to come and sit and be served.
What happened during the revolution was everything came out from behind closed doors. You had very wealthy people who would have chefs at home who suddenly were unemployed. And at the same time, you had all these new political movement happening. People would gather together, and of course they needed a place to gather, so it was cafes. It was a new social scene as well.
Eating out became the hottest trend in Paris. 10 years after the revolution, there were 500 restaurants. Within 30 years, 3,000.
Perhaps we should be thankful for the French Revolution, for them shoving the chefs out of the big houses and making them earn a living feeding the poor.
Into this new world of restaurants comes a young boy who will inspire a culinary revolution. Antonin Carême.
I'm one of those that dislikes the term celebrity chef, but he was the first great publicly applauded chef of the modern era. And you can actually trace chefs back to him.
In 1792, Paris is in chaos after the French Revolution. 8-year-old Carême's life hangs in the balance. One of 24 children, his parents can no longer afford to feed him. So his father abandons him by the city gates. He faces a life on the streets. But a chef takes pity on him and gives him work in one of the world's first restaurants. Carême toils in the kitchen and eventually masters techniques once locked away behind palace walls. A radical innovator, Carême introduces to Europe the idea of food being served in courses rather than all at once. And he was also the first person to introduce chef whites to the kitchen.
Just to see the number of people in the different outfits and hats and garments that they wore, and it did famously all start with Carême.
Carême obsesses not just with flavor, but also presentation. He produces detailed cookbooks that lay out his cake designs and how to make the key sauces of French cuisine.
So many of the ideas that he wrote down about roux and stock and liaisons and classic recipes is still being used today. Without Carême, where would we be? I don't know.
Carême's techniques are the basis of haute cuisine, which literally means high cuisine. And chefs in the city continue to strive for Carême's perfection.
French culture was always about refinement. They've taken eating to the art level. They're constantly looking for the more beautiful version, or at least their own beautiful version. But that's the summit of culture, is the luxury to be able to make things more beautiful than sit back and eat them.
I mean, they really were the first to create a cuisine. It's something you have to master. It's not just kind of cut things up and throw it in at one-pot meals. It's time, it's history. So when you eat in Paris, you definitely want one of those experiences that personify that, a serious life's work.
Episodes of Travels with the Bondi Vet, Saturday at 6 p.m.
Carême was a revolutionary, and the city has a habit of producing them. One of the greatest was Georges Haussmann, who was prepared to destroy 60% of the city to achieve his aims.
We go there and we look around and we're like, wow, this just looks old. But what we're seeing here is really a late 19th, early 20th century Paris, one that replaced a medieval Paris that was knocked down by Haussmann.
Paris, one of the most beautiful cities ever built. Tourists come from all over the world to see its pristine boulevards and epic monuments. But this city has a dirty secret. The revolution freed the people from tyranny, but had done little to improve living conditions.
Paris was an unbelievably dirty city.
These were incredibly overcrowded, unsanitary areas. The streets were pools of sewage, and cholera epidemics would rage through them.
One man was on a mission to change all that. Georges Eugene Haussmann. His plan? Flatten the city center and start all over again.
Now, in order to make an omelet, you gotta crack some eggs. And that meant destroying about 60% of the city in order to impose this new vision.
It's a vision shared by France's leader, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon III.
So Napoleon III gets this idea that what we're going to do is we're going to rebuild this new Paris, going to be bigger and better than before, which means knocking down huge sections of the old medieval Paris, straightening them up, creating these grand boulevards.
In 1853, Haussmann begins building the new city by demolishing the old, destroying thousands of buildings, including the house he was born in.
I think there's an interesting blend between being trapped by the past and creating something new. And sometimes a great vision comes by letting the past go.
Haussmann enlists 1/5 of the Parisian workforce. But even with this vast army of laborers, it still takes 20 years to realize his grand vision. 85 miles of new streets are lined with 100,000 new buildings. Haussmann limits the height of buildings to avoid obstructing sunlight. Paris is reborn as the city of light. But one innovation gives rise to a new problem. The wider streets are perfect for horse-drawn carriages, but the added hoofed traffic leads to roads paved in horse manure. Haussmann's engineers develop a unique solution. Along the roads, they install 12,000 water outlets. Fed by water from the Seine River, they wash away the waste and keep the streets clean. Today, the horses may have been replaced by cars, but it is a daily ritual that continues. Street cleaners, affectionately known as the men in green, still turn the river on and off with a key to wash away the leaves and trash.
The Paris that we love is largely a product of that grand vision of engineering.
When you are in Paris, you feel light on your feet. You feel effervescent. You feel like you are floating. It's an entire ocean of beautiful buildings and people and the most pristine parks and gardens and carousels. It's just beauty for as far as you can see.
Even on a dreary day, you can walk to any of the big squares and it just feels open and it makes you want to run out and just turn around in the street because it's just a beautiful place.
Haussmann's grand plan transformed Paris, but it needed one more visionary to make it the city of today. Monsieur Gustave Eiffel, who gave us one of the world's most iconic monuments, the Statue of Liberty. Yes, that's right. The man who built this first made his name by making this.
We owe a lot to France and to Parisians in general. The single greatest American monument in the 50 states is the Statue of Liberty, for everything it represents.
The statue was a gift to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the American War of Independence, in which the French had partnered with the Americans against the British.
You know, the U.S. owes its existence as a free country very much to the assistance that we got from France in the Revolutionary War, and I think that it's a partnership that hopefully, you know, we return the favor in World War I and World War II, but it's a partnership that goes deep into history.
In 1875, Eiffel and sculptor Frederick Bartholdi began the construction of the statue. Made in the biggest workshop in Paris, she's assembled outside. Her face is modeled on Bartholdi's mother, and she's held up using the same iron frame Eiffel would later use for his tower.
He's really the reason it stands so strong today, because he was an expert on building a structure and not have it blow down in the first storm.
On completion, she's dismantled, shipped to New York, and reassembled on Liberty Island. Fitted with size 879 sandals, she stands as tall as a 22-story building. And at the time, she was the tallest statue in the world.
Now we have this symbol, the Statue of Liberty, that we can look at every single day and remember what it took for so many Americans to get here. And I think it's a wonderful reminder of not only our own country, but our friendship with this other place called Paris.
In 1888, a 1/4 scale model of the statue was erected on the River Seine. It looks westward to her big sister. But for Eiffel, the Statue of Liberty was just a starter. His main dish would be the tower that carries his name. Paris has plenty of iconic structures, but what is the one that defines it? The Arc de Triomphe? The Louvre? Notre Dame? Or is it this 1,000-foot iron tower?
The Eiffel Tower is the Statue of Liberty of Paris.
No matter where you are in Paris, you can see it. And what's interesting is then when you get to the Eiffel Tower and you get on top of it, you start taking pictures, you're like, what's missing? What's missing? Oh, the Eiffel Tower, because I'm on it.
Helping you land the airfare you really want. Widget.co.nz.
The idea for Eiffel's tower goes back over 130 years. Paris wants a monument to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. Some of the proposals are head-turning. One design is for a 300-foot tall guillotine.
It seems to me to be one of those great, like, how could it even get to be at the considered stage?
Oh my gosh. It would make for a terrible keychain.
The guillotine gets cut from the short list, till one design is left. It's the brainchild of Gustave Eiffel, hell-bent on building the tallest structure in the world.
Gustave Eiffel was like the Steve Jobs of the late 19th century and more. He was constantly innovating. And the Eiffel Tower was meant to demonstrate what you could construct with iron and how tall you could make it, 1,000 feet tall. No one had ever done anything like that.
Eiffel originally offered it to Barcelona for their grand exhibition, but they rejected it. It was too expensive and too ugly. The Paris authorities have similar concerns, but Eiffel won't take no for an answer.
So much so was he convinced of its success that he volunteered to invest 80% of the cost to have this built.
Eiffel gambles everything he has and makes a deal with the city. The tower will belong to Paris, but in return he gets 20 years of revenue from ticket sales. Two years later, his tower is complete. Standing 1,000 feet high, it will be the tallest building in the world for over 40 years.
The funny thing about the Eiffel Tower is that when it first went up, Parisians thought, this is the worst thing ever. It's totally ugly. It's totally out of keeping. It's totally not about Paris.
Most of the city's elite, the intellectuals and artists, they hated it. They thought it was ugly. It wasn't decorative. And they couldn't wait for it to be torn down and their beautiful skyline would come back.
But the French public loved it. In its first year, it attracted almost 2 million visitors.
Gustave Eiffel was a very shrewd customer indeed. He knew that it would attract a lot of visitors. The Eiffel Tower paid for herself within 3 years. The next 17 years, I'll leave you to do the math.
For Eiffel, it adds up to over $100 million. The best way to see the view and avoid the lines is to go straight to the Jules Verne restaurant. At 410 feet above street level, you can see for miles.
It's amazing walking here. Always the view is very exceptional. The change of the season, rain, sun, snow, it's amazing.
The Jules Verne has a Michelin star, a sign that it's one of the very best restaurants in the world.
This is magic.
People have lived and died literally by the pen of the Michelin inspector.
The infamous restaurant guide was born here in Paris in 1920 and sold in gas stations. It soon became the final word in restaurant criticism.
At the height of its power, a poor review in a Michelin guide or a downgrade from a 3 to a 2 or a 2 to 1 could mean millions of dollars in revenue to that. It's the difference between staying open and closing.
But recently, there has been a new revolution in Parisian cooking.
Young chefs there are abandoning the Michelin star system. They have looked to America and other parts of the world and said, hey, casual is great. Being hung up on a star system, less great.
Iñaki Aizpitarte is a luminary who has risen above the stars of old. Without a Michelin star to its name, his restaurant Chateaubriand is celebrated as among the world's 50 best. He's replaced the rigors of formal dining with the relaxed atmosphere of a French bistro, a welcoming place with affordable prices stripped of all pretension.
It's a bistro with creative food.
The substance of Iñaki's style is in the food he creates. If the decor appears unrefined, his cooking is inspired by the haute cuisine started by Antoine Carême. On wooden benches among relaxed company, diners savor world-class cuisine once reserved for the wealthy upper crust.
It was maybe a new proposition to make a seasonal kind of gastronomic food in a bistro, a very Parisian place. That was different.
This restaurant movement, like the original French Revolution, stands for equality. It's all about democratic dining.
After 9:30, you can come here without reservation. We make a waiting list.
I remember 20 years ago, there was not a place like that in Paris, and now there are hundreds of great ones, and in fact, it's the predominant style of restaurants opening. It's the modern bistro, I think, turned on its ear, thanks to this new democratic way of looking at food.
Paris's culinary establishment has been shaken by this new food revolution, but it's this rebellious spirit that keeps Paris fresh. And 100 years ago, it's what attracted some of the greatest artists the world has ever known. Picasso, Dali, Monet, Van Gogh, all flocked to the hill of Montmartre. Topped by the Basilica of the Sacré-Cœur, this area has long been the home of creative types. It probably helped that it was once outside the Paris city limits and exempt from city tax on alcohol.
The center of the world was fully in Paris, right? That was where all the culture, where the creativity was going on. And a lot of alcoholics like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, they hightailed it to Paris.
painters, singers, writers, poets. Everybody was here.
This is how Montmartre developed, with a lot of cabaret, cafes, and restaurants.
Olivier's grandfather, Pablo Picasso, was one of the many legends who sought inspiration and fun on these streets. Sometimes he had more fun than his wallet could cover.
My grandfather was very poor, so the only thing he could do is to paint and maybe to pay his rent or to pay people with paintings.
One painting is here at the Lapin Agile, the oldest cabaret club in Paris. In 1905, Picasso gave it to the owner, Frede, to pay off his bar tab. It shows Frede playing the music and Picasso dressed as a harlequin drinking with his girlfriend.
So you have all the atmosphere, all the inspiration in this important painting.
This painting is a copy. The original was sold by Frede in 1912 for 20 bucks. They introduced jazz to Paris, and Montmartre became its center. But when Nazi Germany invaded, the Paris dance scene had to go underground, and that gave birth to the discotheque and nightclubs as we know them today. Paris. In 1940, Nazi Germany invades the city. Among the spoils of war, the Eiffel Tower stands out for Adolf Hitler. When he arrives in Paris, he wants a photo of himself on top of his gleaming prize. But the French resistance has other plans.
The tower becomes such a symbol of Parisian pride and French pride that when Hitler makes his journey and his tour of Paris after the conquest of France, members of the resistance cut the cables so he can't take the elevator up for his proud moment of glory.
There's another way to the top, but 1,700 stairs is a long way to goose step. For once, he compromises. And like a tourist without a ticket, the Führer settles for a photo at the bottom of the tower. Parisians have few avenues to carry out resistance to the Nazi occupation. Except perhaps one. Jazz. Under the Nazis, the playing of jazz music has been banned. Anyone caught can be imprisoned and even executed.
The people who created jazz were a big problem for the Nazis. Black people, Jewish people, people who they viewed as not worthy.
So if you have this kind of floating underground party, right, that is kind of got to be passed through word of mouth, you can't arrange for bands to play in this cellar somewhere. But what you could do is you could bring a record player or a disc player, as they were referred to. And so we get the word discotheque, combination of bibliothèque, the French word for library, with disc.
With records spinning defiantly, discotheques became sweaty bastions of French resistance. But it would take more than an underground movement to save disco. May 1944, Allied forces are closing in on Paris. With defenses crumbling, Hitler knows the city is slipping from his grasp. But there's one prize he's unwilling to relinquish. At the Nazi headquarters in the Hotel Maurice, General von Koltitz receives a frantic order from Hitler: destroy the Eiffel Tower. If he can't have it, no one can.
You got the Nero decree. Burn it, destroy it, blow it up to the ground.
Soldiers rig the tower with explosives. But as the Allies get closer, Koltitz ignores Hitler's order and refuses to press the button.
Insane amount of courage to do that. He must have liked Paris.
Before we kind of celebrate this guy as some great hero of history, keep in mind, he's got the Allies coming. He knows if he obeys that order and he gets caught, which he will, he's going to be dead. So he decides to, ignore the Führer's order and maybe save his hind, by preserving Paris.
French resistance fighters surround the Hotel Maurice, and Coltet surrenders after a brief firefight. Today, visitors to the five-star hotel probably don't notice the bullet hole in the crest above the main entrance. A lasting reminder of the hotel's dramatic past.
If Hitler's order had been followed through on and made actionable, the world would have lost one of the great monuments. It would be horrific and shameful.
With its Eiffel Tower left standing, the City of Love conquered all. Like the smell of morning baguettes, in Paris, romance is always in the air, and affection is on public display. For years, couples came to the Pont des Arts to seal their love with a lock and key.
They transformed the Pont des Arts into the Lovers Bridge, and they covered it with plenty of lockets. And the idea is that you attach a locket with your loved one at the grills, and then you throw the key into the river, you make a wish, and it's supposed to make your love last forever.
But Paris's bridges have been straining under the sheer weight of commitment. Recently, part of the Pont des Arts railing collapsed from nearly 1 million padlocks, weighing an estimated 45 tons. To save the landmark, the city banned the locks, and in June 2015, brought down the collection. But if there's any disappointment among couples, it's sure to be brief, because Paris is all around them.
When you look at an extraordinary piece of architecture like Notre Dame, nothing else can occupy your mind at that time, and that's like being in love, which is why it feels so romantic.
Paris was meant to be experienced. It's unto itself the most beautiful city ever created that continues to show itself off to the world.